I'm afraid that the way the room is, the light is in my eyes, so I can't see you, but I hope you can see and hear me. So I'm going to talk to you about work that I've been doing in Aurangabad in Maharashtra over the past more than a decade. It's work that I'm writing, hoping to finish a book this academic year on this issue. So this is a piece that actually was published some years ago in an edited volume, but it lays out at least what is one of the chapters, more or less, in this book. And this talk is, and one of the reasons I decided to do work in Aurangabad is not just because I have, or as you may know, it's called Sambhaji Nagar now. It's been renamed like so many other places in this country. And but one of the reasons I went there is not just because I have a long association with the city, but also I firmly believe that if we are to understand many of the political, social, and economic transformations of India, really these once small cities becoming bigger cities is where a lot of the dynamism and the real explanatory value we can find in various places is to be found there. It's and I'll try to illustrate this in the case of history and memory. This is indeed what Himanshu was just talking about. And this has particular, I think, importance for the following reason. So I'll begin, I'll see if I can be done in about 40 minutes, so that we'll have ample time for discussions, Q&A, and for comments from the discussant. So reimagining, if not re-engineering, Indian history remains a major concern, as you know, for the Hindu nationalist movement. History, as Tanika Sarkar had suggested years ago, is to Hindu nationalism what race science was to the Nazis. I think that's pretty well put, and there is in fact nothing surprising in this. If we think of it, Nehru's discovery of India set the tone in several ways. The book was written within a genre of popular and nationalist interpretive history, a kind of writing that flourished in the 19th century in Europe and soon developed its many distinct varietals in colonial India. This was a genre that deployed the language of the professional historian to present particular interpretations of the past, but did not follow the documentary methods and conventions of professional historians. Nowhere in colonial India was this particular genre of writing and debating more developed and important than in the Marathi-speaking lands of Western India. Leading intellectuals of this part of India, Tilak, Savarkar, Phule, Ranade, and many others wrote extensive historical tracts in this genre that proliferated throughout the 19th and 20th century. In her analysis of memory and history in Western India, Prachi Deshpande has argued persuasively, in my view, that this genre of popular and political history writing is often based on myths, Puranas, songs, and so on, built and elaborate what she calls mytho-history around Shivaji and Maratha history, and it gave rise to what she also calls a shared sense of historical memory in this region. Deshpande's object, historical memory, is very close to what French philosopher and historian Pierre Nord's now classical critique of memory sites, or what he calls lieu de mémoire in French. For Nord, memory and history are, and this is something that I hope we can get to discuss, are categorically distinct. With modernity, he argues, the nation-state official histories and social memories have ceased to exist as an authentic sense of the past. In its place has emerged in what he calls modern memory, focused on multiple symbolic memory sites, around which new mythical histories are created by multiple groups. And he says, I quote, the task of remembering makes everyone his own historian. Following the example of ethnic groups and social minorities, every established group, intellectual or not, learned or not, has felt the need to go in search of its own origin and identity. He bemoans this tendency in modern societies, and he says that memory sites generally have no referent in reality, or rather, They are their own referent, pure, exclusively self-referential signs that escape from history. So he maintains this distinction between something called real history and something called memory that can be shared. Yet, in modern India, the making of such historical memory and its promise of a distinct and often heroic narrative has been driven by a desire for recognition in public spaces and in electoral politics by a range of different communities over time. The result has been a creation of multiple, parallel, competing, and antagonistic memory archives expressed in carefully staged celebrations of crucial events, dates, physical monuments that are often garlanded and sacralized in a variety of ways as a manifestations of the spirit of the community itself. In turn, these same objects and monuments have also become targets of acts of vandalism that are often described in the local press, certainly where I work, as desecration, corruption, or Rashtakara. So let me get to Aurangabad. Now, as you may or may not know, I'm not sure if we have anyone in the audience from this particular part of the country, but in the 1980s, Aurangabad became more or less a byword for bitter and entrenched communal conflicts between its large Muslim community and the fast-growing Hindu trading and working-class community drawn from the surrounding towns and villages. At that time, Shiv Sena had entered the Marathwada region, declaring itself to be a Hindu fighting force, engaging both Muslims and Dalits in street fights, provoking smaller riots and conflagrations in the streets of the city and surrounding towns and villages. They eventually established a dominant presence in the city. And Shiv Sena's electoral victory in the municipal elections in 1988 set off a serious set of riots between Hindus and Muslims that left many, many dead and hundreds injured. These tensions intensified in the following years and culminated in even more severe and bloody riots following the destruction of Babri Masjid on December 6, 1992. These dramatic events precipitated a significant demographic shift in the city of Hindus and Dalits, and this is something we know from many other parts of the country. Hindus and Dalits began to leave the old city, that predominantly Muslim old city, for newer colonies, while Muslims from mixed areas in the city, from villages in the district, sought refuge and safety in numbers in the Muslim majority core of the old city of Aurangabad. Now, from this relative obscurity, the city suddenly made headlines in 2010 as 150 luxury Mercedes cars were sold to customers in the city, what amounted to be, or hailed to be, the single largest luxury car deal in Indian history. It turned out that the deal was actually organized as a public statement from the business community to the city administration. The vast majority of the customers belonged to the city's small but powerful cluster of Marwari families. The rest were Sindhi and Punjabi builders and industrialists who had all benefited from the city's spectacular industrial bonanza in the preceding 2 decades. The city had grown from about 5 lakh to about 25 lakh today, actually more like 30, and so on, with lots of industrial units and much else. In that sense, it makes the city quite typical in other ways of many other cities like that across the across the length and breadth of India. Now, members of the economic elite of the city had hoped that economic growth would actually spell the end to the isolation and what they regarded as provincial outlook of the city. And many educated Hindus in the city assert to this day that the city's main problem remains the large, impoverished population of Muslims and lower caste Hindus and Dalits residing in the old city. By contrast, the residents of New Aurangabad, the industrial parks, the new residential areas developed by the state development corporations and private companies, hotels, shopping centers set aside apart from the old city, see themselves as forward-looking, professional, and so on. Soon after the quest for renaming of Bombay was initiated in 1995, the same forces in the state declared that it wished to rename Aurangabad as Sambhaji Nagar after Sambhaji, the son of Shivaji, something that eventually happened more than 25 years later. After massive protests among the city's Muslims, it was decided to ask a commission of historians to deliberate the question. That in itself is a highly unusual thing. It happened in the 90s, it wouldn't have happened today. Their conclusion came less than a year later. The city was actually, the commission founded by Malik Ambar in the 16th century. Malik Ambar, an illustrious Deccan figure, an Ethiopian slave who rose to become one of the great and innovative commanders of the Deccan at that time. If renaming was to take place, the commission found the city ought to be named after Malik Ambar. This in turn generated vociferous protests from Shiv Sena as well as from conservative Muslims who decided to retain a certain Persian legacy and a close link to Urdu and Dakhini culture associated with Hyderabad. The issue was smoldering for many years, and then a few years ago, well, last year actually, the city was officially renamed Sambhaji. So let me get to some pictures. There's been concerted efforts over the years to change and rename significant parts of the city, and the rub is, of course, that it's called Aurangabad, and it was indeed Aurangzeb's center of operation for many years during his campaigns in the Deccan, largely unsuccessful, as you well know from history. A relatively new square was in the 1990s named Kranji Chowk, named to commemorate the liberation of Marathwada from the Nizam's rule in 1948, and it features a huge equestrian statue, as you can see there, of Shivaji erected at that time. A few years later, the city's main highway crossing this square was to be significantly expanded, and Shiv Sena argued that this site now had acquired emotional value, and we know this is also now encoded in Indian jurisprudence from the highest levels, that if a site has emotional value, it indeed merits some form of reallocation to the community that claims it. This is the essence of the Ayodhya judgment, as you know. Now, because of this, and there are lots of precursors to these kinds of decisions that have now been officially encoded in law, a huge flyover was built to curve on either side of Shivaji, further boosting the visibility of the statue, which is constantly illuminated by 4 stadium-quality floodlights. Nearby, at the newly created Savarkar Chowk, a big shiny statue of, there is the Savarkar Chowk, a big shiny statue of this Maharashtrian hero was erected in 2002. Interestingly, just next to the old Kasab Mahala, the butcher's area, that was partially cleared in the spring of 2012 and converted into land earmarked for commercial developments. However, as a local municipal council at the time told me, the municipality was worried about whether any community would actually move into this area. As he told me, no Hindu wants to live here, but maybe we can get some of the foreign companies to lease the land. And that has indeed happened, but it took more than a decade. Later on, a statue of Sardar Patel was erected in front of one of the old gates, the Paitan Gate, in the 1980s, and was turned into an overtly communal symbol from the 1990s. As you know, there was Sardar Patel, who was ordering and overseeing the incorporation of the princely states into the Indian Republic, and he was also directly ordering the Operation Polo, the incorporation that I'll come to in a moment. Across the city, almost complete residential segregation has taken place since the early 1990s. It shows you that the really significant effect of riots actually happened in the decades after, many decades after. It's something we have been coming to grips with much more now than perhaps at an earlier time, where we studied riots more in terms of their electoral efficacy, in terms of swinging, and that's still there, but it's the effects, other kinds of effects are happening a long time after that. So These demographic shifts happened as a result of constant and simmering conflicts over space, dalgas, old temple structures across the city. The divisions in the old city are marked by very precisely delineated streets and street corners, tense with little interaction and intermingling between communities, and associated with very precise and well-kept alive memories of the violent events at these locations back in the 1980s and early 90s. Many of the city's socially progressive segments, both Hindus and Dalits, teachers at the many colleges and professional schools, have for decades been critical of the political style and legacy of what many see as conservative, feudal, intransigent Muslim culture in the old city. Here on the Muslim question in Marathwada, the left and the right are pretty much on the same page, and I'll come back to this. The critique of the new feudal mindsets were prominent in the movement for liberation of Marathwada from the rule of the Nizam, the Marathwada Mukti Sangam, that had broad support among upper caste Hindus, Arya Samajis, conservatives, and left-leaning groups as well in the city in the 1940s and 50s. During the general political ferment in India from 1965 to 70, the Communist Party, the CPI, and various socialist and radical movements actually gained a certain foothold in the city and popularity. They won considerable influence, and they were one of the lasting outcomes of that 5 years of political power by the progressives in the city was a new master plan for the city, strongly influenced by progressive and developmentalist visions of the age of the 60s. It proposed radical widening of roads, revamping and upgrading of the existing old city, including covering many of the old nalas dating from Malik Ambar's time, removing substantial parts of the city wall, and while preserving only select gates and monuments. In the spring of 2012, a new activist city commissioner decided to dust off this older master plan and actually implement it. Within a few months, more than 2,000 houses were declared unauthorized and quickly demolished, almost all of them in Muslim areas. The commissioner at the time told me this happened as I had come to the city to begin fieldwork, as a matter of fact. The commissioner explained to me at the time that yes, there had been a more effective implementation in Muslim areas because, as he said, you see, these people have taken out much fewer stay orders in the High Court than other communities. Many of the demolished buildings and shops were left in ruins for several years as a warning, as an official later explained to me. Much of the land was expropriated by the city for redevelopment. A market dating back to the 17th century was removed to make room for a multi-story shopping center with a large parking house. To date, more than a decade later, no developer has come forward to develop this project. It seems that the erasure was much more significant and exciting, politically speaking, than the actual replacement of the structure. In September, and I just want to show, so these are some of the gates that the city is famous for, and the tourists come to see. There are like 52 of them, many in a state of disrepair. They're supposed to be being looked after by ASI, but then I need not explain to you what ASI is doing to a large number of monuments in this country. In September 2017, on the anniversary of the beginning of Operation Polo, the liberation of Hyderabad in 1948, the police action, a new monument was inaugurated in Aurangabad. It's a garden of sorts. You can see it here from a distance. It's a garden of sorts, made in shining marble and stone, sponsored by the city's large companies. At the center stands a gigantic flagpole sprouting from a huge lotus flower, and the Indian tricolor is now visible across most of the city. The site had been an almost forgotten chabutra, known as Kala Chabutra, memorializing the execution of rebellious sepoys here in 1857 by the Nizam's forces. The site had also been an execution ground for much of the Nizam's period. The new monument has three large plaques. me see what pictures. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here we go. This is how it looked, and when it was, there was an early monument. There was and then we have this instead. The monument has 3 large plaques with inscriptions in Marathi and English. One celebrates the executed sepoys, the second independence, and the third plaque, which is most popular with the visiting crowds, commemorates the liberation of Marathwada in 1948. The text depicts the events in 1948 as a culmination of a long struggle against feudal forces and the Razakars of the Nizam state and so on, and mentioned many local Hindu heroes, all leading members of the Hyderabad State Congress. When the monument was opened, the newspapers in the city were careful to mention one particular fact that had been heavily promoted by the city's officials. The flagpole of this new patriotic monument were, in fact, where am I? Yeah, well, there's a fact I'll show you here, 10 feet taller than the iconic minaret on Dalit, the ancient city near Aurangabad, that had been built by the famous so-called Mad Sultan Tughlaq that had marched the whole population of Delhi south to create a new capital in the 14th century. This plaque pointed to a larger, that particular plaque here, that's up behind here, back to a larger narrative that's been gradually imprinted upon the urban space of Aurangabad. The Marathwada Mukti Sangram liberated Hindus and began a new era of majority rule and prosperity in the region. Most of the information available from this period are based on widely distributed hagiographic life stories and Marathi biographies of the leaders of the movement, as well as scattered oral history. A major part of these narratives center on the terror and rapes committed by the Razakar forces in the years leading up to 1948. There are also tales of Hindu families, mostly landowning, fleeing the Hyderabad state to the border areas around the state. So let's just go a little bit into what actually happened during those times, because it will give you a better sense of what this celebration is pitched against. Throughout the latter part of 1947 and early 1948, the State Congress, which is a Congress organization within Hyderabad state, have been distributing arms to Hindu volunteers, many affiliated with Arya Samaj and RSS, across the border territories and inside the Hyderabad state. There were regular cross-border raids and attacks on public buildings, officials, and infrastructure, mostly carried out in what is today Marathwada. In the Telugu-speaking regions, these efforts were actually spearheaded by a young and upcoming Congress leader by the name Nasim Ram. You may have heard of, who had very close links with the RSS from the very outset. In the official narrative of the standoff between the new republic and Hyderabad state, victory was sudden and decisive with the police action in 1948. However, the full extent of the aftermath of the police action has only been slowly and gradually been emerging after having been buried and dismissed for several generations, as a matter of fact. The classified Sundarlal report written by Nehru's private secretary, who was sent by Nehru to Hyderabad shortly after the police action, paint a bleak and dystopian picture of extensive violence, killing, rapes of Muslims throughout the rural areas and small towns of the region, perpetrated by what he in his report calls armed irregulars, that is, RSS and State Congress. It's estimated that more than 500,000 people, black people, left the region and their land, migrating to the cities and to other parts of India, perceived to be safer for Muslims. There are very few records of these atrocities, land grabs, refugee numbers, as the region was under military administration for almost 2 years after the police action. Many documents from the time remain classified and inaccessible. I have tried very hard to look at some of these without any success. When they see my face, the archive is not accessible. Strange, eh? In the years following the military government, public administration was regrouped, and former administrators of Hyderabad state were re-educated As a young IAS officer at the time, when I interviewed him, he was 101 years old, living in Aurangabad, told me, you see, those who have been involved in Rasakat atrocities were prosecuted and dismissed. The rest were trained in our British administration style, and then they got their jobs back. However, this officer and others who were involved at the time completely dismissed the notion that there were any large-scale atrocities or casualties. Many suggested that the Sunderland report, accidentally found and photocopied by a young American scholar, as you may know, in an archive, in fact is nothing but a forgery committed by foreigners to tarnish India. It's a story you will hear in many versions. However, scholars and activists are slowly recovering stories and memories from Muslim families about displacement, theft of land, rape, and killings. These are stories deeply buried in family histories as shameful events, a form of disaster that completely shook the old order. Many of the victims seem to have been minor landowning families, local village elites, by virtue of their land holdings and so on. Others were members of the police force, the army, local officials who've been given land as part of their pay and perks in the Nizam's regime, by the Nizam's regime. I met at least a dozen Muslim families who narrated that their grandfather was a policeman or government servant, had come to Aurangabad in the 1950s, and so on and so forth. Some older people narrated violent incidents they witnessed at the time or atrocities that affected members of their wider family, but few were willing to directly tell me stories of what happened to their own family. And there are lots of people are now talking about this as the second partition, as a matter of fact. Most evidence of what actually happened in 1948 remains circumstantial. I found, for instance, that many Sindhi Hindus settled in Marathwada in the region in the early 1950s, mostly refugees from Sindh. A large part of the Punjabi community in the city descended from former military men who settled there also after 1948. Most of these Sindhi and Punjabi families are today major landowners, builders, industrialists. As I inquired into how they had gotten such extensive land holdings, I often encountered responses as, oh, there was so much land because all these Muslims had gone to Pakistan, which was factually untrue, or in Marathwada land was cheap and easy to buy. That's why we came here. However, some anecdotal evidence, and as I say, it's hard to come by, seems to point to that much of the land was simply forcibly acquired and handed over to these refugee communities by governmental authorities at the time. As a result of this systematic official erasure of the dramatic upheavals, displacements, and mass violence of 48, Muslim memories of these events remain inchoate, subdued echoes of a past that no one is really interested in recovering. The new mainly Hindu administrators were from elsewhere, were openly vested in portraying the police action as an act of liberation and so on. For the older Muslim elite, these events were deeply humiliating, a form of defeat in terms of livelihood, social standing, and political power. And that was what it was meant to be. However, that one can still find considerable pride in the era of Nizam's rule and a good deal of romanticization and nostalgia for the time, whereas many would call we Muslims could live with dignity here in our city. There was also lots of references to the remarkable architectural heritage and the dozens of dargahs strewn across the city, mostly in varying states of disrepair and neglect. On early mornings, one can see tractors and workmen chipping away at the remaining stretches of the city walls, ostensibly under the protection of the Archaeological Survey of India. Now, the recent electoral successes and recent defeat, but build-up of considerable support by the Hyderabad-based MIM party in Marathwada and Aurangabad in recent years undoubtedly owes a lot to their ability to tap into this disavowed memory that cannot find an acceptable discursive or representational form. So this repressed memory seems also to have found an outlet around the local adoration of Malik Ambar, and I'll come to this. It was the work of that historians committee that I mentioned in the beginning around the possible renaming of the city in 1996-97 that brought the legacy of Malik Ambar into wider public consciousness. Malik Ambar was a Habshi, an Ethiopian slave, who, here's a picture of something, it's a well-known miniature. This is his memorial in Aurangabad. Malik Ambar was an Ethiopian slave, as I said, who rose to the chief of the army of Aurangabad and Sultanate in the 16th century. He founded the ingenious water systems, he founded the city, the nalas, the fortifications, and so on. These facts are today the stuff of legends and tourist brochures, but for centuries it had been deeply buried under the grand Mughal narrative that followed it. I had taken some interest in Malik Ambar and his tomb in nearby Kuldabad, which is also home to Aurangzeb's tombs and dozens of other dargahs and shrines. One day, I casually mentioned his name in a conversation with some men in a predominantly Muslim neighborhood where I had done some work over many months. It turned out it was like opening a tap. The men started sharing many stories and tall tales about Malik Ambar, his greatness, how unjustly all the big people had forgotten about him. He was, they said, the original man of the city. It was not Aurangzeb, they insisted. One of them said he's so famous as a soldier that he attracted the envy of Jahangir. Jahangir was also envious of the beautiful city he had built here. He tried to destroy it many times. There was strong enthusiasm and also defiance among these men who held Malik Ambar up as an original Dakhini man, unlike all the other people that came after and claimed the city for themselves. There was also a claim to the city as such that it was emerging here in their stories, and a claim of kinship between working class Muslim men in a semi-slum area and their long-forgotten rags to riches and Habshi heroes. I asked the men if they had been to see his grave. Oh yes, they said, it's right here. I was confused. I said, is it not that lovely dargah out in Aurangabad? I asked. No. That's just his monument. That's just his real Kabri is actually up here behind those buildings, they assured me. Soon, we made our way into the area to find a largest dilapidated 12 feet tall square structure. There was no inscription but a fresh shroud on top and a headstone that looked like a small shrine where candles and incense had been recently burnt. There were also some vessels, and I went to see what they were. My friends got a little uneasy when I looked closer and saw snake skin and some animal bones. Oh, I was saying casually, it looks like some fakirs use this place, right? My friends were a bit flustered. Yeah, maybe, but we are cleaning it up and we'll turn this place into a park, and the work has already begun. Local cooperators of the MIM were actually busy collecting funds and clear brushes around it at the time. I asked the men, how could you be sure that this was actually Malik Ambar buried here? Oh, you see, the old people tell these stories, they told me. And as we walked back, one of the men half whispered to me, you asked for proof, but I think, why do you think that the fakirs gather here at night? If Malik Ambar's body wasn't here, they wouldn't feel the power, would they? These guys know about these things. A few days later, I was taken to an elderly man who told me a colorful story of Malik Ambar's death in battle with the forces from the Sultanate of Bijapur. He narrated how his body was seized at night by loyal troops and transported back into the city under the cover of darkness. Later, I encountered a recurrent story about two funeral processions, one empty going to Aurangabad, another procession inside the city with the actual body going to this modest Kabri inside the city walls. I asked one of the men telling the story what the commander's loyalists had been afraid of. They answered, well, Malik Ambar was born a slave. Many of the big people respected his skills and his power, but didn't recognize him as a king. They didn't want him to be buried in Aurangabad with all the saints. They thought he should only have a common grave. Besides, his followers believed that only if his body was buried inside the walls could his spirit continue to defend the city. So there are many layers in this story. It's hard to make out exactly what's going on, but what do these stories of Malik Ambar's two bodies signify? One of them was a royal body, the symbolic, honorific, but actually empty body buried in Kuldabat. The other is an authentic mortal and black body, a slave who made himself a self-styled commander and king, Malik Ambar, as they would say, whose mortal remains were, like many of the city's dargahs, continue to emit considerable spiritual powers. It seems very obvious that celebrating this minor, disavowed, but also supposedly more authentic grave, right in the middle of a dense Muslim neighborhood, accounts to some kind of retroactive claim to the city's historical founding by non-elite Muslims who feel that they are losing the historical claim to the urban space itself. So let me turn towards the end here. The Nizam of Hyderabad started a welfare fund for Dalits that also supported primary and secondary education in these communities. And in the late 40s, he donated land to Ambedkar's People's Education Society, and a few years later, the Million College of Science opened in 1950. Over the next decades, as you may know, Million College became one of the most successful Dalit institutions in India and produced a steady stream of graduates, many of whom went on to play prominent roles in public life as academics, politicians, activists, judges, and bureaucrats. Outside of Bombay, Aurangabad became the most important site of Dalit Panther activism, and several of the local Panther leaders rose to become significant political players in the city in the decades after. The Dalit Panthers were involved in the long drawn-out Namanta Andolan, a movement to rename the university as Babasaheb Ambedkar University. In the late 70s, this movement resulted in widespread disturbances on the campus, in Aurangabad, across the district of Marathwada, and when Marathas and other caste Hindus attacked Dalit homes, neo-Buddhist vihars, and destroyed statues and photos of Ambedkar and the Buddha. Over a few days, more than 25,000 Dalits were displaced and dozens were killed. The violence was concentrated in 3 districts of Aurangabad, around Aurangabad, where Dalits were enrolled in higher education in the largest number, and where Dalits were most politically mobilized. The pattern we've seen that is completely in tune with how the anti-Dalit atrocities are committed. The atrocities had a galvanizing effect on the Dalit movement in the region. Some Dalit Panther leaders in Aurangabad, such as Gangadhar Gade, adopted a new vigilante-style tactics, in part, in fact, inspired by Shiv Sena, where Dalit militants would board the buses arriving into the city from villages that had been affected by atrocities, pull out and beat up men belonging to dominant Hindu communities if they could verify or get a sense of their name. The Namanta movement also catapulted a number of Dalit leaders into the public limelight in the city. Several of them, such as Gade, consolidated their standing by occupying government land and enabled settlements of thousands, tens of thousands of Dalit families on that land. The renaming controversies simmered throughout the 1980s and only found a resolution with the renaming as a compromise known as Nam Vistar Din, or name expansion, in January in 1994, when the university became Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University. Almost 25 years after the formal renaming, Dalit students today constitute as much as half of all students enrolled on the central campus, and a somewhat smaller proportion across the many regional colleges. Many upper caste families in the region decided to send their children elsewhere, a pattern that continues. The renaming date of January 14th is today one of many festivals in the rich calendar of public celebrations that's observed among the city's large Dalit community. On this day, the entire university area is fenced off, and up to 2 lakh people gather in a festive atmosphere where Dalit leaders of all stripes compete. Everybody hears that Dalit in our movement is big and strong. And today, Bambu, the university, is a symbol of Dalit victory. We made this place famous. And they pointed out a monument that you see here, celebrating the martyrs of the Namanta movement, the victims of the riots that followed, they're now celebrated in this movement or in this monument, and this monument was erected right in front of the university gate in the early 2000s after stubborn resistance from the authorities and Shiv Singh. The Dalit middle class has prospered in the city due to concerted efforts to fill reserve quotas in education and the public sector. The urban landscape is today dotted with monuments that announce Dalit presence. Ambedkar statues, like the well-known ones, as you know, mostly of the signature type with Ambedkar in a blue suit pointing towards the horizon while holding the Constitution in his other hand. Only one statue of Ambedkar is different, and that is, let me see where that comes up. It comes up in a moment. After the renaming of a shiny golden statue was installed right in front of the Batkal Gate, also known as Victory Gate, the city's largest and most impressive gate, in fact erected to celebrate one of Malik Ambar's most significant military victories in 1611. This statue serves as the official Ambedkar statue in the city, where officials pay homage to Ambedkar on Ambedkar Jayanti on 14th April each year. Most Dalit colonies have these brightly colored, as you can see, gates, arches at the entrance are dotted with blue flags and signature color of the Dalit movements. One also finds elephant symbols associated with the BSP, the Bhojans Manch. And around the city there are at least 10 smaller, if not more, monuments with Ambedkar's hand writing in an open book, the foundational act of constitutional writing. So I'll get to the end of this in a moment. The annual celebration on April 14th has been a large and conspicuous festival in Aurangabad for several decades. In 2018, the events of Bhima Koregaon and after turned the festival into an act of mass defiance. And so this is, here's some of the very conspicuous from elsewhere. And this is how, just from one of the Ambedkar Jayantis. The Bhima Koregaon. In 2000, and here's the, I just want to show you here, the Bhima Koregaon colony. In 2018, a number of floats featured illuminated models of the victory column of Bhima Koregaon and people dressed as Mahar soldiers in period uniforms. Even the route through the city has significant overlap with that of the annual Ganpati festival, except that the end point of the Ambedkar Jayanti procession in the Ambedkar statue is this historical Batkal Green. At the current hyper-politicized conjuncture, this festival is always performed and presented by Dalits as assertion, contestation, as a conscious counterclaim to the space and to the city as such, set against the dominant Hindu claims to the very same space. A similar logic seems to be at work around the Bhima Koregaon as a new Dalit icon. While martyrdom and suffering have been the heart of most older Dalit narratives, icons and claims and celebrations, including the commemoration at Bhima Koregaon, is inaugurating a new and more assertive frame. A group of young Dalit activists and students I talked to in the city some years ago expressed a new historical inflected sentiment, and they said the following. You see, the older generation of Dalits asked to be respected as human beings, but now the situation is different. We're all educated. We have a lot of power in the city. The Bhima Koregaon, we're all learning new things about our history, about Dalit achievements and value. The older people were forced to be humble, but we don't want to be like that anymore. Now, let me conclude here. An older genre of nationalist history writing in the secular key has, across India, given way to multiple other forms of historical memory work, mostly along lines of religious community, region, and caste. Some around what we today might call minority histories, others, and more forcefully, of course, majoritarian claims of an unbroken Hindu history. In Aurangabad, and as indeed in other parts of India, the effects of this memory work are complex and heavily linked with conflict. And I think one can argue that what I found in Aurangabad you can find in many other cities across the country. The city has at least these three competing, intersecting, overlapping, but almost mutually exclusive urban memory spaces, each replete with martyrdom, sacred space, monuments, and webs of significance that are virtually unknown to the neighboring community, or the antagonistic community. These are, in many ways, what Gadamer many years ago called effective histories that shape the temporal horizon within which communities can relate to their own imagined past, and thus very impactful on the present. They're also deeply affective history, relaying first and foremost what an RSS activist in a memorable phrase described to me as our emotional truth. Secondly, this mass production of competing memory sites, if you like, often in contiguous or overlapping spaces, are not merely sites of representation of an imagined past. Memory sites, statues, monuments, plaques, gates, and so on, constantly produce more memory because they're physical points where a community can be attacked, desecrated, insulted, and so on. Each conflict, each clash and contestation adds more memory and adds more urgency to a process of sacralization and commemoration. In an almost textbook version of what Durkheim argued about religious sites and religious spaces, the celebration and anointing of distinct memory sites transform these spaces, artifacts, times, and dates into semi-sacred entities set apart from the flow of everyday life and invariably projected as expressing the innermost essence of the community in question. Rather than seeing this process through Noir's lens of a story of a decline, of a fragmentation, of a secular national memory space in India, we maybe need to recognize the proliferation and articulation of multiple forms of memory work as very intrinsic to the very unfolding of democratic desires of articulation, of desires for recognition, visibility, and self-definition. And so in some ways, the narrative, the older, let's call it Republican narrative of the Indian past, or secular Nehruvian past, as held together by a underlying civilization of unity, seems in fact at this juncture to be one of democracy's most conspicuous victims. Thank you very much. Oh,